I'm delighted that we have Baroness Julie Smith with us, who is a Cambridge professor and also the Liberal Democrats' defence spokesperson. We have Wolfgang Reisman from Media Dialogue, which does a lot of work in Ukraine on media literacy. And we have Olivier Védrine from Jean Monnet Association in France, who is an expert on Ukraine, political scientist, an activist, and until very recently was living in Kiev, where he ran, amongst other things, his own public affairs television program. So we have a fantastic panel, and our three questions. As you know the routine by now. Just let me remind myself of them. So, Julie, who will be supporting the opening of accession talks with Ukraine when the EU Council meets in December? And please, can I ask our panelists also to speak into the microphone? So you might share one of the microphones.
Thank you, Roger. Is this on? No, it doesn't sound like it.
That was working.
Thank you. Thank you to Roger for the invitation. And as others said, thank you to, it was James who said it, I think, thank you to Ukraine for fighting our war for democracy. And I think one of the things that is so important about what is happening in Europe at the moment is precisely that Ukraine is fighting for the very democratic values for peace, security and democracy that underpinned the integration process in Europe over the last 70 years. So should that mean that 27 member states all say in December, yes, Ukraine should be a member of the European Union, and yes, that will happen very quickly? Maybe. But I think there is one country that has already threatened to block Ukrainian accession negotiations being opened, and that is Hungary. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, Hungary, along with Poland and Estonia, was one of the poster children of accession, of transformation, of being ready to join the European Union. And yet that transformation in Hungary has led to illiberal democracy and a reluctance to allow a country that's espousing democracy to join. What's interesting is Pravda.eu said that Orban promises to block enlargement. And that use of the word promise suggests or indicates, I think, how close Hungary has become to Russia. So I think that is the real problem. Even if negotiations were opened in December, they would take some time. But I think that's the biggest challenge for Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry for my voice, but I hope I understand well. I represent Media Dialogue. This is a project started 2015, shortly after Maidan, and meanwhile with universities, journalist organizations, and artists, meanwhile with representatives to organizers in Armenia and in Georgia. Belarus, the Belarusian Association of Journalists and External, is a member, Moldovan journalists are a member, to bring together the post-Soviet societies, young people, students from universities, and journalists and artists. This was the idea, and when it started, 2015, I visited a country in a process of birth. This was the first cry, let's say it in this way. And for me, it's until now absolutely impressive how democratic values and the will to build up a democratic society in Ukraine is alive in the hands of the young generation. That really this young, European-orientated young generation is fighting for their rights, is fighting for democracy, and naturally at the moment is fighting on the front line. So for me, Ukraine is a really worthy, people of Ukraine, really worthy imports for Europe too. This is not only a one-way situation, this is a two-way situation with a lot of values coming from Ukraine to Western Europe. So for me, it's not the question to be pessimistic. I am optimistic that the changes of Ukraine society, under the pressure of the war, under the pressure of economical crisis at the moment caused by the war, are an engine to change the society in a way that NATO membership and EU membership will be possible in the future. That does not mean 1 or 2 years, but the dynamic in the Ukrainian society, also in societies like Georgia Party, by the people or by the government, are also things we have to recognize in Western Europe. In Britain, as in the EU, we have to have a sharper look to the things happening in the East to understand what has happened after the collapse of Soviet Union. And we have to think the Europe of the future, maybe in 20 years, but this Europe will be another Europe than we have at the moment. And therefore, I'm optimistic when we support Ukraine in a way that this war can be ended not with a victory by Putin. And as a German, let me say last sentence, I would like a little more, not support for Ukraine is great, but it's necessary to say it a little louder in Germany too. Thank you.
Merci, Roger. Thank you very much for this invitation. I want to speak about some stories. I spent 10 years in Ukraine and Kiev before I was in 2 years in Russia. And we say NATO, maybe yes, maybe no. EU, we say. Putin unified Ukraine, and Putin will push Ukraine in EU and in NATO. I explain why. I was on Maidan from the end of November to the end of February. I spoke several times on the Senate Maidan, and I was the advisor for Ukraine for the President of the European Economic Security in Brussels. Everybody, that was special times. And Maria was with us. We were like a team, believing values, fighting for Europe. Stop to be Soviet people. Because Putin is not a Russian, Putin is a Soviet person. And Ukraine want to leave this Soviet mentality. Then I did Maidan. After that, I was TV presenter, and I did some TV program against Russian propaganda on national TV, national Ukrainian TV channel. At the same time, I wrote a lot of articles on television and gave a lot of interviews. And I remember when I say, we must give the status of candidate to Ukraine. During years, from 2014 to 2022, everybody in Brussels and Paris knew it's impossible. I wrote an article in February 2022, the call from Kiev, l'appel de Kiev, in the tribune de Genève. In this article, I asked Ukraine to have immediately status of candidate. This article was published the 24th of February 2022. My friend Maria Menzenseva, you know Maria Menzenseva, take this article, share this article in the radar, and some piece of the ideas of this article was in the document of Zelensky to ask for the candidacy. And the candidacy happened. Why? Because his story doesn't wait. And yes, you can say it's not realistic to go to the EU. It's not realistic to go to NATO. We have to be realistic, but we don't need cynicism. And as Putin unified Ukraine, Putin will push the candidacy of Ukraine to be in NATO and will put Ukraine to be member of the EU.
Thank you very much. A poignant word, if I may say so. And so remember our other two questions. Perhaps we can take them together. We understand where the push for accession is coming from. How long will the talks take? What will need to change in Ukraine? What will need to change in the EU? Again, very questions that are going to be very easy to answer very briefly, I'm sure. But do your best, and we can perhaps go 15 minutes later for the coffee break. So I'm going to give you, the space that I promised you, if that's okay with our audience. And I hope we'll have time for questions from them as well. So back to you, Julie.
Thank you. I should perhaps preface these remarks by saying I was endeavouring to do what Roger had asked, which was a short answer on the first question. And I don't want people to think that my saying that I think Hungary might block the accession negotiations means that I think they should do that. Absolutely not. But I think we also need to be very clear that even if Ukraine started the accession process in December, began negotiations, the process of joining the European Union has historically been a long and complicated one. So I'm afraid I'm here as something of a British pragmatist. I am supportive of European integration, and I'm supportive of Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union. But I think, can that realistically happen while Ukraine is at war? I think that raises some issues. But even without the Article 42.7, and here I will admit that I've just been reading an article by Sonia Besh and a colleague from the Carnegie Endowment, when they reminded us about the EU's mutual defence clause, which most of the time we don't talk about because it hasn't been triggered. But outside of NATO, that would still be a potential issue. So I think there are going to be some challenges for Ukraine to be negotiating membership. But one of the key things about the accession process is it provides the opportunity for reform. And Bob mentioned corruption. Well, that's one of the things that the European Commission has mentioned. But the accession process would give time to be thinking about change and reform. So I think negotiations could start, but realistically, we would be looking for 5, 6, 7 years. And that's not about any one country seeking to be difficult, but it's about realistic reform. Because if we learned anything from the accessions in 2004 and in 2007, it's that meaningful long-term reform is absolutely essential. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges for Ukraine to persuade the EU 27 and also the European Parliament that those reforms have been made. So I think there are opportunities, but I think there's a need to be realistic as well. So, as I say, I apologise if I'm here being a slightly pragmatic person, but I think we need to be realistic.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. But I want to say another idea. When we want to fight against corruption in Ukraine, I think we need a campaign against corruption in Europe too. This is We have been with our media dialogue project also in the Balkan region, North Macedonia, with the friends from Ukraine, and reporting. And we know from Serbia, you mentioned it, we know from Croatia, the Balkan corruption problem is on the table. Meanwhile, also the negotiation with the EU mentioned. We have this big problem with the NATO member, Turkey, and we have Hungary as well mentioned. So what we need, I think, is a rebuild of the internal structures of the EU to fighting against corruption, fighting for democratic values, and fighting for democratic justice system and so on. Let's take this crazy situation with Putin and this brutal war also as a chance for making own reform processes in Europe possible. And in this way, Ukraine will become, I'm sure that Ukraine will become a really great partner in this, let's say, new Europe as a wish. I think it's also necessary to think over the days and not to think only based on the situation today.
Merci. I say yes, but I am afraid about one thing. I was in Kiev 10 days ago in European interviews, and I'm afraid about one thing, that during this winter, because the Russian defense is very efficient, and I believe that the Russian offensive on the front is possible, and will cost a lot for Ukrainian soldiers. That will increase the speed of our talks about NATO membership, about EU membership. Putin will not wait, and I think he will increase the speed of his special operations, and we will have to increase the speed of our decisions. And I am very afraid about that, and I think during winter, at least in spring, Putin will plan a big offensive on the front of Ukraine, and we will have to be there, and that will increase our speed of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ria has a question, please.
Thank you. I just want to ask about your recipe, what we have to do before winter and spring, like 2 or 3 tasks, what we have to do more now.
We have any more questions? Martin Bond.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm very much in agreement, I think, with Olivier's rather fearful view of the future, rather than the very positive one, although I appreciate a lot of change has happened already in Ukraine, which I know distantly, but I know for about 15 years now. But I think much more important, even on concentrating on that, is to see it from the other side of the divide. What does it all look like from Moscow? It's a very old quotation, but far back, the American president said, just at the turn of the end of the Cold War, that the Soviet Union without Ukraine is no longer a great power. And that's the state from Moscow. And it's not just without Donbass, and just without almost a Ukraine. It's without Ukraine. And the stakes there at the moment are as high as that. And that's what the position on the Western side has to take account of, rather than, it leads obviously to the prospect of another push in the spring from their side, and it leads to a push in the spring gently, trying to move the pieces on the chessboard. It's a very crude image, it takes away all the horror of the war. The pieces on the chessboard to a more advantageous position for subsequent negotiation from Moscow. I think we should take very, very seriously the size of the stake as seen now in Moscow.
Thank you. One more question? Yes, brilliant. Thank you. And just say who you are, please. Sorry, I don't know you. Thank you.
It's Paul Savage. I work at Global Policy Issues and the South China Morning Post. Does it come to mind if I move forward to post-war economic reconstruction and Ukraine's accession to the EU? Over the last decade and a half, the EU and Ukraine engaged with each other through the association agreements and deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. And this has brought about significant trade integration between Ukraine and the EU, amongst other things. However, one of the criticisms, perhaps, in a Commission opinion in June of last year, was that in terms of achieving the Copenhagen criteria, where Ukraine perhaps has a somewhat disadvantage is that it has very low value-added production, industrial and agricultural production, and low levels of trade. So my question is, how does the panel see the landscape in post-war economic reconstruction going forward? And it seems to me that the economic landscape will have to be fundamentally driven by the European Union, not in bits and starts, but in a complete sort of refashioning of the Ukrainian economy and massive support for the Ukrainian economy, and effectively kind of a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine involving hundreds of billions of euros or dollars. It will have to be a huge undertaking, I think, and I'd like to know what the panel sort of views. How can I get these to
Thank you very much for that question about the accession agreement, because if I had one more question, that would have been it. And in fact, I believe the vote is quite strong this year. So we had a question from Paul about that, and we had tell us what we need to do, and we had from Maria, and we had what does it look like from when you look at this from Moscow, and we have but we have a few minutes, so maybe 5 or 6.
I was actually going to let Olivier start because I thought at least Maria's question was directed to him. I think I'm going to try and tackle Martin's question, and I say this very much as a West Europeanist, but I am aware that statements by NATO and by the European Union have clearly caused concern at various times in Moscow. But I think we have to consider whether we make decisions that are the right decisions for our institutions and for sovereign countries that aspire to be members of Western institutions. And I don't think we should be saying, particularly vis-a-vis the European Union, well, Moscow won't like it, therefore Ukraine shouldn't be allowed to be a member, that it shouldn't stay neutral, as somebody said to me the other day. Well, you know, after the Cold War, Ukraine was meant to be neutral and it changed its mind. Well, I think Ukraine should be allowed to do that. I think the situation with NATO is somewhat harder because although we may see it as a defensive alliance, I'm very aware that it doesn't necessarily look like that if you're in Moscow. But I think in terms of the European Union, we should be looking for ways of Ukraine becoming more closely associated. How close that becomes and when that becomes membership is another question. Would you like us each to take a question? Yeah.
Okay. For the reconstruction of Ukraine, you know, first we have to finish the job is to win the war. After that, we'll speak about the reconstruction. You know, every day I am obsessed about one thing. How much of my students I learn from. I teach in a lot of universities in Ukraine, and especially I gave courses in Tarashenko. And part of my students did also military training. I gave also a conference in military institute of Tarashenko. Now they're on the front. Then we have to finish the job, we have to leave. And to answer you, Maria, yesterday we had this nice dinner and I spoke with this very smart MP, Alex. And in my opinion, we have to be unified. That means the West. This is a fight against our democracy. And I believe that if we not do something, unify our democracy, and that means US, EU, UK, to face and to show that we are unified against Putin. And what I proposed yesterday is to do maybe here in London conference to invite all the Western democracy, include of course Ukraine, Russian oppositions, to show to Putin that we will never give up. Never. Never give up. We are strong, but we didn't start the battle. We didn't start the battle. We have to start. Russia now is in an economy of war. We are not. Tomorrow, if we freeze the conflict, the Russian propaganda will call that a victory. And they will restart in 5 years, because they need 5 years to replace their weapons. Then we have to win now. And I invite you, Englishmen, and this is a Frenchman, we invite Englishmen. But we have to do something here in London. London was the town, capital of resistance. De Gaulle was there with Churchill, and you know that I am a fan of Churchill. Then we have to restart this way of thinking of resistance of democracy and never give up our values. For that, we need to be unified. Not only the government, but the people, the European people, with the US people, with the people who believe in democracy. We are not the leaders, we are on a battle. We need to come back. Now the advantage is to Putin, not for us. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. Democracy, please wake up.
Yes, democracy is a weapon, and we should imagine that the war in the East started not last February. It started, you can say, 28 in Georgia, south of Ossetia, and Abkhazia, the first Russian aggression, perhaps even before Chechnya, when Grozny was bombed down. So, and in Ukraine, it started 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and the so-called rebels in the Donbas region, which were Russian soldiers. And I saw also the wounded soldiers, 10,000 of them died in the Donbas region before this Ukraine war started. So I'm absolutely with Olivier when he says that even when there is a frozen situation, this war will not end. The Sur war will not end in the former Soviet Republic. So we have to send a really great sign to Putin, to the kleptocrats in Russia, to this regime, that we will stop them and we will give all of the people in the East the chance to live in a democratic European Union and hopefully to become also a member of NATO, which was discussed in 28 as you remembered. So let's be optimistic that really democracy is a weapon. And when I see in my last word that what happened in the last year during the war in Ukraine, the Ukrainian army, it's my impression after several talks in Kiev too, and one of our partners is meanwhile a soldier, former journalist. This is a NATO army meanwhile because of our help. Technology, the military technology came to Ukraine, made another army, made an army which is compatible to NATO armies, and this is one base we should also imagine to see these perspectives, not thinking in years, but thinking in this great challenge to say no to kleptocrats in Russia and to kleptocrats in like Putin regimes and this killer regime.
There seems to be a call coming from this panel, perhaps from this conference, which might summarize as democracies of the world unite in the face of this challenge. But now it's time to say thank you to our panel. Have a cup of coffee, and please take your seats again.